Hi, everyone. This is the first session in a series of expert interviews and panels we will be conducting as part of an initiative to promote best accessibility practices for the Web3 community. For this endeavor, we have received a grant from the Ethereum Foundation, and so first we wanted to thank them. And the subject of this talk is voice interfaces and multimodal design in the context of Web3 accessibility. Therefore, it's with great privilege that I introduce Preston So, Senior Director of Product Strategy at Oracle. Preston is a globally recognized authority on the intersections of content, design, and code. His impressive repertoire of expertise includes omnichannel content strategy and multimodal content design, conversational and immersive design, full stack development, and multimodal accessibility and inclusive design. He is also the author of the book Voice Content and Usability, where he highlights best practices for voice interfaces and as well his groundbreaking work in leading the Ask Georgia Gov project. And I hope we have time to touch on it towards the end, but if not, no worries. It's a very engaging read and he goes through the whole process. So we're gonna link to the book below for anybody who's interested. So welcome, Preston.
Thank you so much for having me, Mona. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thanks, also to the Ethereum Foundation for helping sponsor this as well.
So I wanted to start off with a very interesting point you bring up in your book. And you also quote Chris Morey on this subject. And so screen readers translate the visual web elements to audio, and they're the predominant means for blind or visually impaired users to engage with content. However, sometimes they can be a bit verbose or they don't always translate those visual structures well. Pure voice interfaces might provide a means to address some of these frustrations and user pain points. So can you elaborate on this point and maybe what design considerations can make pure voice interfaces more streamlined?
That's a great question, Mona. And I think it's really important to highlight the amazing work that Chris Morey has done. He's a blind technologist who was quoted in Wired as saying that screen readers are really interesting from the standpoint of accessibility because they translate the, as you said, visual structures of a web page or a website into a audio or sound landscape that's a little bit more understandable for those who are members of the blind community. But of course, one of the issues with that is that you're really starting from a place where the screen reader is translating what is originally a visual hierarchy, a visual manifestation of content and of a user interface into something that isn't really necessarily built for that purpose. What I mean by that is, if we were to build from the first standpoint of saying, well, let's build something that's going to be a first-class citizen or using best practices for those who are members of the blind or low vision community, you're probably not going to start out with a website that's really difficult to navigate with a screen reader that has a skip to main content link or has other accessibility considerations. Because the fact of the matter is that whereas the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, and a lot of the accessibility standards that have now emerged in the web community are very, very powerful, very good tools, they still don't fundamentally address, I think, one of the drawbacks of screen readers, which is, well, at the end of the day, you're just kind of translating something that is meant for visual consumption into something that is for audio, but it doesn't really actually sound that great. So I agree with you, Mona. I think pure voice interfaces are a really great way to maybe kind of plug that hole a little bit, allow for people who have different ways that they want to access their content, different ways that they want to interact with their user interfaces, a much richer means, a much more conversational, much more dialogic, or a much more, let's say, improvisational approach to how they actually conduct those interactions. Because at the end of the day, one of the problems with screen readers is that they just kind of read what's on the page. They might read buttons, they might read form fields, but the output that comes out is not only very verbose, it can also be very, very difficult to use. And I think this is very important when you think about this from the context of cryptocurrency transactions or decentralized finance, for sure.
To transition from that then, so what is your process or recommended framework for formulating the structure of a command? So for Web3, we could use informational voice interfaces, which would be useful for answering user questions, probing for data maybe, or providing guidance on Web3 concepts. But then there could also be transactional voice interfaces where it's an on-chain transaction, such as a token swap or governance voting in a community. So also, in addition to that, what works better for informational versus transactional voice interfaces?
hmm Yeah, that's a very interesting segue, I think, into several considerations here. First, of course, you mentioned, Mona, the distinction between informational and transactional voice interfaces. The author of Designing Bots, Amir Shevat, calls that distinction, topic-led versus task-led voice interfaces. But I think we have to take a bit of a step back here, because one of the first things that we have to think about when it comes to a command, not only where we are today, but also where we've been in history. And I think a very, very good place to turn to for some insight here is the interactive voice response system, which emerged in the late 1980s, early 1990s, as a way for phone hotlines to be able to process user input and understand what people actually wanted to do when they called a customer service hotline. If you've ever called an airline, hotel conglomerate, if you've called any sort of virtual switchboard that manages your call and transfers you to the right department, that's a really good example of what's known as an IVR system. And I talk about this at great length in my book, Voice, Content, and Usability. Now, the way that a lot of those commands work is through a sort of wildcard approach, where the IVR system will just say something like, well, hey, what do you want to do? Just tell me in a few words what you want to do, and I'll figure out how to translate that into some form of machine input that makes sense to the computer that's going to eventually handle this transaction or search or query or whatever it is. You have to respect the historical underpinnings of how people have been working with these voice interfaces, working with chatbots in the past, by allowing them to engage with this sort of open-ended input. Now, this is very important because back in the day, a lot of the first voice interfaces that emerged, and I'm thinking about Domino's Pizza, Capital One credit card, these were some of the very first Amazon Alexa voice interfaces that emerged when the Alexa Skills Kit first was released on the market. They were really good at handling transactions, handling tasks, but these were very, very brittle commands, right? You had commands like order a pizza, check my credit card balance, do things of that nature. And a lot of those sorts of transactional commands can certainly apply to doing things like a token swap, for example, or a governance vote. But the issue here is also that because the world of decentralized finance, Web3, all of this blockchain is so new to so many users, one of the crucial components, I think, of any voice interface that handles any of these sorts of considerations is to have an informational component, allowing for users to be able to ask questions about what they're doing. What is a token swap, for instance? What is a token, even to begin with, right? A lot of these questions oftentimes aren't answered by chatbots or voice bots because of the fact that informational voice interfaces can be a little bit more challenging. They involve search queries, they involve a little bit of learning about what the user wants and actually respecting that query, as opposed to transactional voice interfaces, which are really focused on, well, just give me a verb as a command, order me a pizza, give me, extra pepperoni, give me a Coca-Cola. Whereas a lot of the informational voice interfaces, and Ask Georgia Gov is a really good example of this, the voice interface that was the first ever voice interface for citizens of the state of Georgia. I talk about this, of course, in my book, Voice, Content, Usability. One of the things that's really interesting about that project is that we started from this notion of, well, we don't know what transactions the user might want to do, because the user is asking questions about what's going on in the state of Georgia, what they can do, what they're capable of doing, but we don't want to actually thrust them into that transactional stage of the conversation too early, because it can be a little bit too challenging for the user to really understand. So when it comes to a framework for a command, I'd say there's really two considerations, and I think you hit it on the head there, Mona, which is, number one, thinking about the informational versus transactional distinction. Is your voice interaction or your conversation that's happening between your user and your computer something that is more informational, more transactional? Do you allow for more open-ended queries or more open-ended responses that a user can issue to a prompt? Or is there really just a series of commands that is really limited to a very, very specific and small short list of commands? And that's, I think, much more appropriate for when you get to that stage where maybe it's the second part of a conversation you might have with, for example, a slot, right? Is At the beginning, you might say something like, well, okay, do you want to, do you want to learn more, or do you want to go straight into performing a transaction? Then from that point, you can kind of bifurcate and say, okay, well, here's the fork in the road where we kind of distinguish between, okay, some open-ended query that's more informational, and a command that's much more focused on actual transactions you can conduct, which is the more transactional side of things. That said, there isn't really a hard and fast rule. I wouldn't say that because voice interface design is evolving so rapidly, because there's so much change and evolution happening right now. At the same time, there's also this notion, I talk about this in my book right now, where a lot of voice interfaces, especially those that are built on machine learning and neural nets, are increasingly adept at not even having to make that distinction at all. They can process the input that the user is providing and then just kind of help figure out what to do next. But of course, I think one of the things that we have to consider is a lot of us don't have the privilege of having access to a machine learning framework or being able to parse through what a user says and do things like natural language processing in this very, very intelligent way. So if we can't do those things, how do we get to that short list? And that's where I think having a verb-focused command, having a very, very clear set of commands, but also having alternate routes for those commands. For example, somebody might not say, I want to perform a token swap. They might say something different. They might, say something that isn't quite the expected input that the machine expects. And that's something that we want to design for as well, which means actually catering to those potential alternatives and thinking about synonyms that might apply for certain verbs and certain nouns that exist in an application.
And that was actually a really good segue, because that was my next question is, so coming up with alternatives for commands, and you touched on it, but is it better to design them then to be more simple with less variation and therefore less room for error for interpretation by the machine?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great segue, Mona, into, I think, the sort of error-prone nature of voice interfaces. Obviously, I think we've all dealt with phone hotlines or voice interfaces or Alexa devices or GPS systems in our cars that misunderstand us, that don't actually know what we're saying. And there's really kind of two types of errors that occur within a voice interface. And this is the kind of thing that is going to point us towards a solution for what you're talking about. There's two types of errors. The first type of error is what's called a non-understanding error. And this is a simple error where, based on the interpretation that the machine has made of your utterance, they don't actually understand the output. And this can be because you've used a word that doesn't exist in that particular natural language processing mechanism. You might have been garbled. You might have said something that potentially was superseded by some noise that happened in the background. And then there's also what's called no match errors. And these no match errors really occur when there's just a complete lack of actual programming for something, right? So you've actually done something, you've said something that the machine understands, but there's no programming, there's no plan, there's no system, there's no scheme for what happens next. There's no idea of, okay, well, this is what I should do to respond to this user. And there's two types of errors that fall into that category as well, in-domain and out-of-domain errors. I don't want to go into too much detail there, but one thing to keep in mind here is that it is certainly valuable if you don't have the luxury. And so there's an important distinction between those frameworks, conversational frameworks, that have more privilege or more luxury or more features. And what I mean by that is frameworks like Amazon Alexa, Apple Siri, Microsoft Bot Framework, IBM Watson, Google Dialogflow. These, of course, are more adept at handling variations of input. And there's actually ways in these frameworks to program for those potential variations in input using things like alternatives for templates in terms of how users respond. Here's a good example of this, right? Let's say, for example, you want the current value in USD of some currency, right? And to do that, you might use a variety of different words. In these frameworks, not only can they intelligently potentially actually analyze the output of the user and go ahead and process it based on what it intelligently thinks it could be, there's also a glossary or a means of putting in alternative words in there so that you might have other words in addition to things like check. You might have, I don't know, stuff like verify or other things that you might be able to put in there. But if you have a much more limited kind of set of considerations, this is where things get very interesting. And I talk a lot in my book, Voice Content Usability, about the notion of spoken menus. You know, if you have a more limited situation where you really have to create your own voice bot from scratch, you don't have the luxury of relying on these foundations for regulatory reasons or compliance reasons or other things, you do want to limit the error surface area to a very, very small surface area. And what I mean by that is maybe starting off with a larger welcome message, a longer welcome message, a longer welcome prompt that gives the user a much more descriptive sense of what they can say, encapsulates very clearly what they can say within the available templates that you have available. And then that allows you to avoid those errors while simultaneously also reducing the amount of programming you might have to do or the amount of custom work you might have to do to account for some of these other possibilities, especially if you don't have the luxury of, let's say, a full machine learning framework or some of these things. And this is really the gray area of voice interface design that becomes really challenging, because this sort of consideration, how much do I customize, how much do I really handhold the user, is something that every single voice interface designer has to consider from the very, very beginning. And it makes things very challenging from that perspective. And especially for an area that's a little bit more, let's say, low knowledge, in the sense of a lot of people have not yet been awakened to getting onto Web3, getting onto some of these new platforms and some of these new ideas. The onboarding becomes more challenging, and it becomes a much more important consideration for users who might have never encountered these things before.
Absolutely. And the point you made about regulation was also a very important consideration.
Mm-hmm.
So now I want to move forward. So the topic of this conversation was voice interfaces and multimodal design. So I want to kind of gravitate towards that. I have a kind of very interesting question, and it's once again why we're very privileged to have you, because you have a very wide array of expertise. So I wanted to ask, so multimodal design and omnichannel content strategy is design that goes beyond just visual and oral interfaces. Could you mention some important considerations and how to approach auditing for Metaverse or equivalent blockchain gaming projects or immersive technology?
So I'm really glad you asked that question, Mona, because actually early next year, my next book is going to be released. It's called Immersive Content and Usability. It's a spiritual sequel of my book, Voice Content and Usability, and it deals with exactly what you're talking about, which is, okay, now that we're talking about web and visual and art and voice, now what happens when we move into immersive and physical and locational and augmented reality, virtual reality, haptic, right, which is of course a very key word here. So there's a lot of considerations, and what I will say is it really depends on different factors. The first is, of course, the notion that oftentimes when we use these sorts of interfaces that go into the metaverse or go into the immersive environments that we increasingly see emerging on the market today, what's happening is that we're engaging with our bodies from a somatic perspective, a physical perspective, but we're also emerging into this world where we are interacting with physical space, with physical environments, the settings around us. And it's really about the interaction of our physical bodies, our physical manifestations of ourselves with these spaces, whether they're real spaces like in the world today, or if they're virtual spaces like in the metaverse or other metaverses that might exist apart. This is a really interesting consideration, though, because a lot of things begin to impact how this works. And if I was to write even another sequel to this book, I would potentially call it something like Haptic Content Usability, because when you move into all five senses, right, I think immersive technologies really play with this notion of moving into the other senses, the other sensory modalities. So we're talking about touch and smell and moving into feeling. One of the considerations for content auditing in particular, and auditing your interface, auditing just how your overall milieu of interactions works, is to make sure it works while people are potentially moving, while they're in motion. This could be if they're in an immersive environment, where they're in a virtual space, or if they're in a real environment where they're interacting with, let's say, some sort of an augmented reality application or a virtual reality application, or something based on location, right? If you've got gamified, for example, as you were mentioning, some sort of a gamified blockchain app where there's some sort of thing going on where you have to achieve certain goals in the physical space, those sorts of considerations mean that you have to keep in mind, okay, how do I do usability testing for when a user is in motion, right? Because generally speaking, most of the time when you're talking with a voice interface, when you're using a web interface, when you're interacting with a screen reader, you're usually not in motion. You're not moving, you're not driving potentially, you're not walking around. So a lot of the things that we want to do is limit the length, for example, of what's popping up. We want to make sure to limit context switching when it comes to the interfaces that we want to use in an immersive environment. But most of all, we want to make sure that a lot of these things that we want to do, especially when it comes to things like gamifying a physical space or gamifying, let's say, aspects of our physical environment, we have to make sure to avoid some of the health and safety risks that come about, where people might collide, where people might, encounter traffic jams, things of that nature. And then the other side of it, of course, I think, is when we get into considerations around things like haptic input and output, right? If you're using your body for, potentially to perform interactions, and you're using gestures that are much more complex than some of the touch gestures or click and tap and scroll gestures that we have on our screen-based devices, these things become a lot more challenging because you want to really deliver feedback in a way that makes sense. And this is where I think a lot of the challenges around accessibility become much, much clearer, is how do we deliver standardized haptic feedback that allows for a user to understand that this was a positive or success message, this was an error message. Are there ways that we can leverage some of the things that have already been found and have already emerged in video game design, for instance, with things like vibrating controllers or other things of that nature that can really influence that potential there. But the big problem that I see still right now within the context of immersive and haptic design of user interfaces and of content in general, user input. And we know, for example, that a lot of the user input methods that are available today for immersive and haptic technologies are not very accessible, right? If you're talking about things like using fine motor skills, for instance, to use a joystick or use a controller, it's really hard for a lot of disabled folks to be able to do that. So how do we actually enable potentially a gestural controller or some sort of a controller that doesn't require the use of fine motor skills or doesn't require a whole lot of cognitive overload when it comes to thinking about context switching? So context switching obviously is a really hard thing. And you mentioned earlier also, Mona, and I want to actually revert back to this a little bit, is you mentioned the notion of multimodal design. There's a very important notion, and I think this was from Sylvia Plath, who's a very prominent designer and author. You want to avoid what are called interaction cliffs, where potentially when you're doing context switching, when you're switching channels, especially between, let's say, a website and a haptic interface and a virtual reality headset, these context switches can become very challenging for users from an accessibility perspective. And you want to communicate them well, you want to be very clear about the choices the user has, and you want to limit any frustration that might appear, in addition to obviously avoiding those pitfalls that might occur from users who need a certain way of using their interfaces to work without fine motor skill. So those are all things I think that are important. Cognitive overload obviously happens a lot when you have users that are either unaccustomed to what they're using, or when users are forced to do things that might be really challenging, for example, for those with ADHD or those who have cognitive disabilities. And that's where I think accessibility becomes a really big challenge, multimodally, multidimensionally, across all of the different interfaces that we have to think about today.
Absolutely. So we're just about coming up on time. Any closing remarks before I close out?
Absolutely, yeah. So I want to say thank you, Mona, for having me here today. Thank you to the Ethereum Foundation. Thank you, Haptics DAO. If you want to learn more about me and my work, you can go to my website, Preston.so. I am Preston So on LinkedIn. I'm not sure how much longer I'll be on Twitter, but you can also find me there as well. Also, I've written several books that might be of interest to you. If you're interested in web development, I have a book that came out last year called Gatsby: The Definitive Guide. I also have a book, obviously, thanks to Mona for mentioning it, Voice Content and Usability, that came out last year. And then early next year, you'll see much more information about it very soon. Immersive Content and Usability, also from a book apart, which will really touch on a lot of the things that we spoke about today, will be coming out early next year. And I'm very excited for that as well. And last but not least, if you want to catch more of my writing and stuff that I work on, you can see my writing at CMS Wire. and other places as well, including my blog, preston.so/blog.
And thank you everyone for attending. We hope this was useful in design considerations to make Web3 projects more accessible. Once again, thank you to the Ethereum Foundation, and thank you again so much, Preston. It was a privilege to have you. And we're gonna link for anybody who's interested in your book, and as well the forthcoming book in the bio below.
Thank you, Mona, appreciate it.
Thank you everyone, have a good day.